Hello, thank you for taking the time to learn more about our journey in better understanding prevailing public narratives and what narratives are we advancing together. My name is Raquel Hatter, and I have the honor to serve at the Kresge Foundation's National Human Services Program as Managing Director. Before we get started, I would like to thank our partners, APHSA, ASCEND at the Aspen Institute, and Protagonist. To get us started, let me provide a little more background on our journey today. In 2018, we completed our strategy review, where we clarified our North Star, which is to advance social and economic mobility driven by a two-generation approach to ensure economic success from one generation to the next with a racial equity lens. During the strategy review, we identified understanding narratives and narrative development as areas of priority. Soon after strategy review, we were receiving inquiries to support narrative efforts. With this in mind, we knew that we needed to learn more to inform our point of view on narratives to determine the best way we should work and partner with the field in this effort. At that point, with the assistance of our communications office, we identified protagonists to assist us with learning more about narrative analytics, narratives driven by the public discourse, and more. You will learn more about this from Emily at Protagonist later in this webinar. After we received the initial results from Protagonist, we held a convening, Flipping the Script in 2019 with partners from the field to gain insights and feedback. One of the aha moments or revelations during the first session was the realization of the role we were all playing in the advancement of both desired and, yes, undesired narratives. This heightened awareness sent us all on an introspective journey to determine a way forward collectively. After that session, we leveraged the feedback to refine the information and held a final session in 2020 with many of the same partners and some new partners. A key difference in the two sessions: the first session was just about the narratives that were identified. The second session added two focuses: how we process narratives and tools to advance the narratives we desire. Where are we going now? We are showing this webinar, which will be followed by information and resources to build a narrative playbook, which will include proof points from the field. Now I will hand it off to Tracy Waring-Evans at APHSA.
To help us flip the script, we need to better understand why narratives matter and what's behind them. Hi, I'm Tracy Waring-Evans, the President and CEO of the American Public Human Services Association, and in our work at APHSA and alongside our strategic partners on the Kresge Human Services team, we believe that narratives must be part of our solution toolkit. After all, they are directly connected to the complexity of the world as we see, hear, and experience it every day. My brief remarks that follow are shared from that of a practitioner and narrative champion. In other words, I'm not a framing, cognitive, or social scientist, but rather someone who has applied the research on narrative change to the field of health and human services. To understand why framing is so core to our collective work, we have to start by peering inside our thinking apparatus, in other words, our brain. To be more effective framers and influencers, we first need to know: what are we speaking into, and how does the information get heard? We have to understand how any of us make meaning of incoming communications in order to open communication lines to more productive ways of thinking. When we communicate an idea to someone, we want to believe that we are speaking into a blank slate with someone who is not only listening to us, but fully receiving what we have to say. The reality, however, is that we are speaking into a sorting device that's been taking information in from the time we were very young and constantly finding ways to process it. So far from a blank slate, we are speaking into years of accumulated information. And as we'll explore more fully in a moment, over the course of our lives, we apply cultural or simplifying models that make it easier for us to think about incoming information. And when we communicate an idea, we actually see very little of what's in the mind of the receiver. We see the opinions expressed in response, and if we're lucky, we might catch some nonverbal cues, but we do not see any of the organizing frames that shape the opinion expressed. Frames are the organizing principles that we use to provide meaningful structure to the world around us. They are social, shared, and persistent over time, and we are constantly mapping incoming information to them. We are always selectively responding to things we hear, like a news story, by queuing up the networks of associations we have stored to help us make meaning of our world. We are constantly mapping new information in a way that appears to fit our existing mindset. In other words, our mind has a whole set of pre-existing patterns of thinking. When we hear new information, it forms a neural network in our brain, sort of like the groove in an LP. The more often something is repeated, the deeper the groove, or organizing frame, it leaves in the brain. Information feels truer the second time you hear it, and more true each subsequent time. Newly received messages on the same topic tend to slide into the pre-existing deeper grooves. In our culture, certain narratives are repeated over and over and become shared narratives. You can spot them in common expressions and stories that almost everyone knows, and how those expressions translate into widely ingrained values and beliefs. These become cognitive shortcuts, if you will, for how we process new incoming information. Again, this is why it's important to know what's already in American culture, the grooves where your communication may land. You'll hear a number of these as Protagonist shares the results of its research and how the narratives of poverty, social and economic mobility, and racial inequities show up in our news outlets and social media platforms. On the screen are just a few of the grooves that we do not want to fall into when communicating our work. Us versus them thinking, for example, triggers worthy, unworthy, or deserving, undeserving narrative traps. Understanding that these are default mindsets is key to being able to disrupt them and shift to more productive ways of thinking. As protagonists will share, these unproductive mindsets are often triggered by how stories of poverty, social and economic mobility, and racial inequities get shared. Talking about, quote, helping vulnerable populations, end quote, or stopping the gutting of the social safety net, or even describing the stress that people with low incomes endure often triggers us versus them thinking, even though these are often intended to support anti-poverty efforts. You'll see elements of these shortly in the narratives that Protagonist found in its research, including in the narratives that are intended to strengthen support for human services. And of course, these show up in the narratives that truly are aimed at restricting access to the quote-unquote safety net by describing people as poor because of their choice and an over-reliance on government. I use air quotes around safety net because we know terms like safety net themselves have long-standing partisan associations and can conjure up politics as usual, as well as negative charity and government mindsets. And so much of our narratives today are shaped by online communications in social media and the multiple places we get our news beyond traditional press, which can deepen the grooves even more. We experience echo chambers through Facebook and other online platforms. People who we know, who are often quite a bit like us, read our posts and we read theirs. Whatever we like or share, Facebook shows us more of. This narrows and amplifies this effect. And I think any of us need only take one look at the apps on our smartphones to see the ways that social media platforms attempt to maximize engagement by triggering the race to the bottom of the brainstem, or put another way, unfortunately, fear, anger, and outrage win over cute puppies and kittens every time. It's also important to understand other forces we're up against when trying to communicate productively. Complex, long-standing societal issues challenge our ability to take information in. Researchers have found that human beings don't have an unlimited capacity to think about risks or concerns. In fact, our capacity is quite limited, something social scientists have dubbed as a finite pool of worry. Similarly, we are prone to fatalistic thinking. If we believe a challenge is too big, complex, and entrenched to address or solve, we will, like Chicken Little, be so obsessed with the sky is falling that we won't be able to focus on the root of the problem, or, more likely, we're so convinced that there's nothing we can do, we choose to ignore the issue altogether, often tuning out what is being said. Almost any narrative about poverty runs up against these two roadblocks. Whether the blame is centered on the system or on individuals, it can feel too big to tackle. As Marjorie will circle back to after we hear from protagonist research, there are ways to flip the script and create productive narratives that can advance the solutions we know are key to social and economic mobility and race equity. At this time, let's hear from our colleagues at Protagonist.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm Rita Parhead, the CEO of Protagonist. My colleague Emily Kane and I will be sharing with you some of our research on the narratives about poverty, social and economic mobility, and racial inequity that we have identified and analyzed in the broader public conversation in the U.S. First, I want to describe what we mean by narratives. As Tracy said, organizing frames are the mental models or cognitive shortcuts that help us make sense of new information. Narratives are the structured stories that help shape those organizing frames. They are stories in a literal sense. They have characters, both heroes and villains. There are plot points and thematic elements, and they often include an implicit or explicit call to action. As Tracy alluded to earlier, narratives are fundamentally social in nature. They are shared stories that animate a public conversation. Because they are shared stories, they were reflected and reinforced in traditional and social media, which means that they are observable and, with the right tools, measurable in all sorts of different ways. One final note on narratives. They're not always based in fact. A number of the narratives that Emily will take you through may strike you as based on false and often offensive assumptions or faulty logic. But narratives are powerful because, whether or not they reflect objective reality, they shape organizing frames and therefore can shape how audiences view an issue, which policies they prefer, and even how they behave. I'll hand it over to Emily now, who will take you through our research, which provides a sort of mapping of what we call the narrative landscape around poverty, social and economic mobility, and racial inequity in the U.S. She will tell you about the 11 narratives we identified in that landscape, many of which you may recognize from your work in the field. These are narratives we have seen in the data and have been able to measure and track over time.
Thanks, Rita. I'm Emily Kane, the Vice President of Client Solutions and Research Lead for this work. Before we go through the 11 narratives we found, I want to give you an overview about how we found the narratives in the media. Using a data feed, we isolated articles from publicly available online media websites that talk about poverty, racial inequity, and social and economic mobility. Looking at a year's worth of data from July 2018 to June 2019, we created a data set that had over 18,000 articles from over 1,000 publications within the United States. Using natural language processing techniques, artificial intelligence, and machine learning algorithms, we were able to sift and categorize the data. We found 11 narratives in the media conversation, and we're going to walk through each one, but broadly, they can be categorized into 3 groups. Narratives that argue to strengthen the social safety net, narratives that argue to weaken or restrict access to the social safety net, and one narrative that can be used in either direction. One thing to note here before we move forward. Some of these narratives might feel familiar, and some of them might feel uncomfortable. A reminder that these are the narratives that, as Rita said, are being reflected in the media, and so they're not always based in truth, but people believe them, so they hold power. Let's dive in. We'll start with the 6 narratives that argue to strengthen the social safety net. You'll see here the thesis statement of each narrative in black and the call to action or proposed solution in red. As we walk through the narratives, there are several different dimensions that you can use to evaluate them. For instance, who is to blame for poverty? In storytelling terms, who are the heroes and villains cast in each of these narratives? Who is deserving of assistance, if anyone? What is the level of individual agency a person possesses? Are they playing an active role in their circumstances, or are there larger systemic forces at play? And finally, whether the government should play a more active or more passive role in assistance. The first narrative, Poverty Exacerbates Stress, focuses on the additional mental load that people who are poor face, whether it's trying to find childcare so a parent can go to work, or how to make money stretch to the end of the month. This narrative points to research that says poverty has been empirically proven to negatively impact and limit an individual's growth and potential. It often takes a dispassionate tone in explaining the psychological and behavioral effects of poverty, and is often used when discussed why safety net programs are needed. The next narrative, Fighting to Stay Above Water, focuses on the constant struggle people who are poor face to make ends meet. It talks about the disproportionate amount people who are poor have to pay for housing or health care. It also talks about how they have no second chances. A medical emergency can wipe out any savings, or run-in with the law can result in a ban on receiving any benefits. The idea is, despite how hard you work, it's impossible to get ahead. In its articulation, there can be some resignation here, in the sense that regardless of what you do, it's never going to be enough. So benefit programs are essential to help give people a leg up. As we've monitored this conversation periodically, most recently we've observed this narrative being invoked very often when policymakers discuss relief packages during the pandemic, such as the CARES and ARC Act. Similar to Poverty Exacerbates Stress, the next narrative, Zip Code Destiny, is one that uses evidence to make its case. Except rather than focus on the individual, it argues that economic opportunity is largely dependent on where you live. Those who grow up in neighborhoods with high concentrations of poverty and crime, or places without access to quality education or jobs, aren't given a real chance to break out of poverty. We often see references in this narrative to the legacy of redlining, which set up racially segregated neighborhoods. This narrative highlights that this geographic segregation of resources disproportionately affects communities of color. It advocates that the government must do better in allocating resources and programs to communities that are impoverished, and that it's the government's responsibility to step in and provide equitable opportunity for all. The next narrative, Dismantle Structural Racism, uses the history and legacy of the suppression of people of color to explain and contextualize disparities in economic and social mobilities that we see today. It most often focuses on the experiences of Black Americans, particularly since June 2020 and the protest for racial justice. It argues that a country built on white and male supremacy have worked to keep all people of color down and have prevented generations of Americans from escaping poverty. It argues that until America reckons with its racist past, there will not be opportunity for all. War on the Poor is a narrative that says the government's mission to devalue and stigmatize people who are low income has succeeded. Under the guise of fiscal responsibility, all levels of government have not only cut away the social safety net, but also intentionally enact policies that inflict pain on the most vulnerable. It portrays policymakers as callous and villainous, out to aggravate the challenges people who are low income face by slashing the social programs that keep them from going under. Rather than cutting essential programs like SNAP or ending eviction moratoriums, it calls on policymakers to put policies and programs in place that give people a leg up. The final narrative that argues to strengthen the social safety net is This is a Moral Crisis. It most often focuses on children. It says that in a country that is so rich and economically well off, it's unacceptable that people here are poor. It often uses a charity framing to tug at the heartstrings and invoke sympathy. We see articles associated with this narrative often focus on child hunger and school outcomes, but notably, it focuses only on children, not families. The next set of narratives firmly advocate to restrict access or get rid of social benefit programs altogether. These 4 narratives touch on themes such as the perception that poverty is the result of some sort of moral failing, use stereotypical characterizations of people who are poor, and argue that there are winners and losers in a capitalist society. The Breakdown of Families uses the following story to make its case. Americans used to live by a few basic principles. They worked hard, they looked out for their families, and cared about their communities. But the traditional family structure has collapsed. Children are now born out of wedlock, fathers are increasingly absent, and community bonds have been broken. This narrative squarely places the blame on the disintegration of traditional 2-parent homes, and without that structure, argues that values such as discipline and responsibility have eroded, resulting in a lack of work ethic in both school and work settings. In order to break the cycle of poverty in America, the narrative argues that a revival of traditional American values is needed, and that will have to come from individuals and communities, not the government. The next narrative, A Bunch of Moochers, argues that access to steady benefits without any conditions makes people lazy, and they are therefore unmotivated to ever better themselves. Over time, people in poverty feel entitled to the benefits they receive and take advantage of the system. Though a bit dated of a stereotype, the idea of a welfare queen would fall into this narrative as a prominent character. Importantly, it believes that poverty is a choice, and if people really wanted to better their circumstances, they could. It also strenuously argues that able-bodied adults should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, tapping into this idea of the deserving versus undeserving poor. Work, Not Handouts is the logical extension of A Bunch of Moochers, in the sense that it says if people want to be eligible for benefits, there must be some sort of work or volunteer work component as a condition. It believes that the so-called progressive policymakers created a bloated welfare state that encourages the poor to become reliant on government checks, creating dependency traps that take away people's sense of agency. Rather than help people, liberal lawmakers have created a nanny state. Work Not Handouts stresses that attaching work requirements to welfare benefits will inevitably empower people and build their self-sufficiency. With a patronizing tone, it emphasizes the dignity of work as a way of bringing purpose and meaning into people's lives. The final narrative that argues to weaken the social safety net is Capitalism, the anti-poverty program. It's a narrative that wholeheartedly supports the status quo. In fact, it argues the system is working as intended. It says that everyone has a different set of skills, and inevitably, not everyone is going to rise to the top, and that's okay. As a society, we have no obligation to try and improve people's circumstances. It goes so far to say that if you want to lift people out of poverty, reduce restrictions put on job creators, who would be able to offer more opportunities to more people, tapping into the logic that a rising tide lifts all boats. Finally, the last narrative is one that can be applied to either strengthen or weaken the social safety net. And while it might seem odd how this narrative can cut both ways, it allows a broader section of people to believe in its logic. The American Dream is Dead argues that opportunity for the average American is no longer what it once was. While corporate profits have soared, most workers haven't received a raise above inflation in decades. Workers have no voice. Students who are drowning in debt chime into this narrative as well. There is frustration and resentment to those who are robbing regular people of opportunity. Who is being blamed for this? This is where the story diverges in its characters. In some of the data, we saw that the blame was being put on immigrants who are coming into this country illegally and stealing jobs. Others blame Wall Street, greedy corporations, and the 1% who are putting profit and wealth above all else. Regardless of the villain, there is consensus that globalization, automation, and the rising cost of education have contributed to the current situation. there must be some way to restore opportunity to hardworking Americans. That concludes the 11 narratives we found in the media around poverty, race, and economic and social mobility. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Marjorie Sims from Ascend, to walk us through the next and final section.
Hello, my name is Marjorie Sims, and I am Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute. I will provide a short overview of the work we've done with the Frameworks Institute to sharpen communications about the two-generation approach. These resources are intended for the two-generation choir: parents, public sector leaders, practitioners, researchers, and funders who are implementing a two-generation approach. The framing centers on the value of human potential to prevent the public from defaulting to the common us versus them thinking, and instead prompt people to a we or collective approach to solutions. In 2019, Ascend released Framing Two-Generation Approaches to Supporting Families. This is a playbook for two-generation practitioners and policymakers. A messaging guide complements the playbook. This is evidence-based advice grounded in original social science research from the Frameworks Institute. Again, these resources reinforce the use of human development and human potential frames. A human development frame advances the idea that people grow and change over their lives in an ongoing process shaped by environments and experiences. It establishes that society has a role and a stake in ensuring that the vital conditions for optimal development are available to all, not just some, across various stages of development. Importantly, we begin the playbook by providing a one-sentence definition for the two-generation approach, and it is: two-generation approaches build family well-being by intentionally and simultaneously working with children and the adults in their lives together. This definition includes the goal of a two-generation approach and what makes two-generation approaches unique from other approaches. Graphics are another important tool for communicating the two-generation approach. Ascend developed this graphic to illustrate that we want to update programs and policies so that they are designed in a way that building the well-being of adults is connected to supports for children and vice versa. The playbook promotes the use of metaphors about construction, including that team effort is needed to build well-being so that people understand the varied and holistic supports that are needed to enable everyone to thrive. Throughout the playbook, there is an emphasis on hitting an aspirational tone. For example, a message about standing in solidarity could be: when we support well-being, we make sure that everyone can reach their full potential and contribute to our communities. Maximizing people's potential helps our communities thrive. Using terms like we, everyone, communities drives a message of standing in solidarity is critical to addressing our country's problems. On this slide, you see a list of frames to avoid and a list of frames we should advance. There are many terms and frames that the public interprets as about fixing people and not systems. To reframe, we must focus people on the gap or the problem that is blocking equal access to essential resources and services. In the playbook, we ask that you consider a question when you review your own communications. Does this framing position human development as an issue that matters to all of us or only to those families immediately affected? In summary, throughout the playbook, we offer 10 recommendations for framing two-generation approaches that you see listed here. The playbook, again, is intended for the two-generation choir. the parents, the public sector leaders, practitioners, researchers, and funders who are already implementing two-generation approaches. It offers guidance on how to make intentional choices about where to start your communications, what to emphasize, and what to leave unsaid. With the right framing, two-generation approaches can begin to resonate beyond the choir, attract new advocates, and include new voices.
That concludes this webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join. Thanks again to our partners at APHSA, the Ascent at the Aspen Institute, and Protagonist. And thanks to the many partners across the field who continue to be on this co-learning, co-creating, and yes, co-action journey to support families and communities in realizing economic success from one generation to the next.